Welcome to State of the Science. This is a new way of talking about research in the field of type 1 diabetes. This series is a celebration of the power of debate and discussion that women scientists in type 1 diabetes research bring to the table. We have a global audience of scientists here today, and we thank everyone for joining. I'm really going to now very briefly, introduce the panelists. They'll set the stage for this discussion, and we're going to walk, we'll ask them to weigh in on their thoughts of 3 to 4 pressing questions in this arena. And conversation is going to be free flowing, kind of like a cross idea exchange, town hall and respectful debate. We're going to pause at 2 different times points to conduct polls with the audience, and we'll have a panel weigh in on the audience voting feedback. So a couple of pro tips for attendees: to submit a question, place it in the Q&A. You can submit questions throughout the presentation, and participants can also upvote favorite questions. At the end of the session, we will also answer questions as time allows. The event is being recorded live on the Sugar Science, and it will be housed on our YouTube channel for further viewing. So in the interest of saving most of our time for discussion, I'm going to do super brief introductions for each of our scientists. We actually could take up the whole time discussing each of them and their contributions. They are very valued and integral members in the T1D research field, and you can connect with them on our website in the CoLab or reach out directly. So I'm going to just start at the top with Dr. Linda DiMeglio. She's at Indiana University. She's a professor of pediatrics and division chief of pediatric endocrinology at Indiana University Riley Hospital for Children. She works in clinical research with a focus on type 1 diabetes prevention, beta cell preservation, and new technologies and therapeutics. And she's a center director and chairs the publications committee for the TrialNet Network, and she's the PI of the Immune Tolerance Network TIDE study. Bridget Wagner, PhD, is located at MIT, the Broad. She's the director of pancreatic cell biology and metabolic disease in the chemical biology and therapeutic sciences program at the Broad. And she's an institute scientist. Her group's research focuses on chemical biology of diabetes with the aim of identifying small molecules capable of increasing pancreatic beta cell number and function, and the ultimate goal of discovering new therapeutic approaches for diabetes. Dr. Alice Long is located at the Benaroya Research Institution, and her lab is a translational immunology lab focused on discovering how the adapted immune system is dysregulated in human autoimmunity. And she was instrumental in the recent work with the highly regarded teplizumab trial. Amanda Borens, MSc, is coming to us from CPATH, where she's the executive director of data sciences. She's a data science leader with 25 plus years experience across public and private sectors, including academia, healthcare, and biotech. Dr. Kellee Miller is coming to us from T1D Exchange. She's the senior director of research services at T1D Exchange, and her academic focus is epidemiology in type 1 diabetes. She's been involved in the establishment and the coordination of the T1D Exchange clinic research, network and registry, which includes 80 clinical centers in the US, and has enrolled 35,000 adults and children with T1D into a comprehensive registry. So that's awesome. Then Marissa Hilliard, PhD, comes to us from Baylor College of Medicine, where she's an associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics and a pediatric psychologist with expertise in behavioral aspects of living with and managing type 1 diabetes in young people and their families. Dr. Marina Basina comes to us from Stanford. She's a clinical endocrinologist and a clinical researcher with a focus on diabetes management, thyroid and adrenal conditions. And her primary interests are type 1 diabetes, diabetes technology, and diabetes in pregnancy. And last but not least, Dr. Cengiz. For over 14 years, Dr. Cengiz has spearheaded diabetes-related clinical studies, focusing on methods to accelerate insulin action, diabetes technology, and automated insulin delivery and closed-loop systems. And she is now a professor of pediatrics at UCSF after a long and fruitful career at Yale. So, distinguished panelists, will you set the stage for this discussion, which is clinical trials in T1D, integrating technology with T1D trials, strategies for next steps, and basically how is it that you see the community should make sense of the sea of data that has been amassed at this point, sort of like best practices, ways forward, how patients or how scientists can optimize the understanding of this data, as well as use them to develop new paradigms in the following areas, understanding the etiology of type 1 diabetes, developing the best treatments for T1D patients right now, and ultimately developing a cure for type 1. Okay, so let's see. We'll start at the top of the order with Dr. Long.
Great, thanks. I'm going to try to share some slides. Great. And so really what I do is just share a first pitch that including immune data in this whole sea of data is really important. On the left, I'm showing clinical trial results that have been published from a TrialNet study of teplizumab. And the home run of this study is that it really resulted in a median 2-year delay in type 1 diabetes with treatment. What I want to emphasize in sharing this is on the right, this is unpublished data, where we are studying features of the immune system that correlate with better response. And we find that at 3 months, the level of exhausted T cells can, if you're in the highest quartile of subjects that have the highest level of exhausted T cells, you can completely not progress to type 1 diabetes in that group. Yes, it's a small group, but I would say that this really gives us some power to think about how we can use immune data to add to everything else to understand the immune system and what we're doing with therapies. And so what do we, as immunologists, and particularly at Benaroya Research Institute, think about when collecting and integrating all of this immune data is really what is the best timing and consistency and method for sample collection. We've been doing this a lot of years, so have others, but really consistency in sample collection is important. Then we've got to think about sample sparing assays to run. Which ones? How consistent are they? And how integrated are they? We also have to balance consistent with the analytes that we measure in trials, across trials, with integrating next generation technology. We've been doing this for more than a decade now, and kind of 10 years ago, technology is not the same as yesterday's. And so, but we do need to learn how to mesh that data. And then we really need to learn how to integrate all this immune data with all of the beta cell measures and publish as quickly as we can so we can share. So those are my thoughts on kind of the sea of data, and I'll probably leave it to the others to share their perspectives next. Monica, I think
that was great. How about Amanda Borens? Would you like to have a word? Oh, unmuted.
I think I'm the person that's most familiar with the phrase, I forgot my mute button. I also think that I'm probably most familiar on this panel with this idea of the sea of data that we deal with. And so I'll just share with you some of the challenges, because I was reading through some of our talking points today, Monica, and I was thinking about what would I do first. And I'm going to be unpopular when I say all of it, because you know, the challenge today, and not just in type 1 diabetes, but in any disease area, the challenge really is about being able to collect data from multiple studies so that you can maximize your statistical power and account for a lot of variance. That's one challenge. The other challenge is integrating different data types. So you can't learn anything from genomics data unless you have phenotypic data to go along with it, right? That's an example. Mm-hmm. And then harmonizing data across different study types. So at CPATH, what we do is we bring in data from clinical trials and observational studies, which might be just very academic, and they might be run by clinicians in medical school. You know, so there's a range of possibilities there. Patient-reported registries, and especially for several of our data types, then it gets a little bit more in the Wild West. So I'm going to list continuous glucose monitoring or any other type, you know, that's specific to type 1 diabetes, but any other type of therapeutic area where many different companies are taking advantage of wearable devices and continuously streaming devices. And I think a lot of folks who are not in the business of analyzing these types of data and looking for answers from these types of data don't recognize how incredibly challenging it is just to put these things in the same bin and make use of them across, because so a perfect example would be that if you're running a clinical trial, it's a challenge to come up with the right models. It's a challenge to come up with the right statistics. It's a challenge to identify, and like in the previous slide that Alice showed, it's a challenge to identify the sources of variance so you can find subpopulations of patients. But what we're really dealing with right now, what we need to be really good at doing, is taking advantage of multiple different kinds of data, from genomics to streaming device data, to clinical trials data, to patient-reported registries. Every single one of those requires some work for standardization. And that's a little bit of a loaded topic, because if every hospital or company is standardizing differently, then it's not helping us to try to combine and aggregate data for secondary purposes. Another point that I wanted to make, just in looking at our talking points, is that this idea that harmonization is somehow automatable is just really a fool's errand, in my opinion, from many years of experience trying to do that, right? So what we're doing, and I saw that there was a phrase AI, machine learning tools, that was mentioned here. And what we're doing at CPAP is looking at ways that we can take advantage of AI and machine learning to identify variables that may be called something different from one study to another. So we're certainly looking at really advanced data science techniques to try to automate some of that ingestion and harmonization, but there will never be a replacement for a good ethical data manager or curator to standardize and clean up data. And so kind of my last piece is that when we talk about standardization and how important it is, it comes down to metadata as well. Your data dictionary and the study design actually is quite important for interpreting data in a secondary way. And then using standardized nomenclature. So sure, you can map, for example, all of your metformin amounts or doses, but if you're not using units, or you're inconsistently using units, or you're letting patients just sort of select which one it is by typing it, then there's a lot of work there. So I mean, I'm giving you sort of a spectrum of the possibilities from what we see from data, but all of those things are important. So I can't say that making sense of a sea of data, if we could just get more genomics data, is not the answer, right? It's all of those things together. It's having good cooperative and standardized ways that we all do this, so that if any hospital or academic institution that finds something interesting, those should be replicated in other places. And the only way that's possible is if we're all agreeing to some standard ways of collecting data and storing data and standardizing the way that we record information, right? And then kind of my last piece of it, making sense of the sea of data, is one of our challenges, not just with T1D, but certainly with T1D, is that when you're looking for high quality data, that tends to live on the clinical trials end of things, and for a lot of reasons, right? But that also means that there is a bigger concern from these companies that if they overshare information, they might be giving their competitors advantage, right? And so culturally and philosophically, that's something that I'm always out there advocating for, is that good science doesn't prevent, if I've missed a pattern in my own data, and somebody else can find a pattern that I didn't see, then absolutely that's how science works. It doesn't work by saying, I didn't find anything, so I'm going to hide it in a drawer in case somebody else found something really smart, right? So I'm constantly fighting that battle. But I mean, I think that for T1D, one of the things that has frustrated me specifically as a data scientist leader is how often we get de-identified data that is de-identified to the extent that there's no actual scientific value in the data. So that often will happen. So I'm just going to leave you with this thought that I like to use the analogy from Indiana Jones, where the Ark is being studied and it's actually being pushed by an older janitor down a hall into a big warehouse where nobody can find it. And so I think that I really advocate for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. And I think that some companies and some even academicians can be kind of the worst offenders in this way. They like to tick the box and say they've shared data, but they make it as inaccessible, unfindable, and unharmonizable as possible, so that it's not really actively being reused. And so when I say we should share and agree on these things, I honestly mean it. Don't take all of the information out of the data set that makes it valuable before sharing.
That's a fantastic point. I would also like just comment that, the fair data initiatives and the NIH mandates are kind of trying to corral or guide some of that behavior, I guess. And what's your quick thought on that?
I've seen some remarkable way. Now I have a 14-year-old son, and so I'm an expert in finding the loophole kinds of discussions, right? But if you're very clear with this is my expectation, a teenager can often find the loophole where they've actually technically done what you said, but that's not what you meant. I think there are people finding the loopholes still. I mean, ticking a box to share it somewhere. And so I'll kind of reuse my statement about metadata. How does it help anyone if you have a custom data set with custom variables and you upload that and you don't say how often they were collected. You don't say what missing values mean. You don't say what units you know what I mean? Those things, there are things that people can do to meet the NIH requirements without actually sharing data. If that makes any sense. I don't know if anybody else on the panel has experienced that, but it's quite frustrating.
Yeah, that's something that needs to be addressed. It's a gap, it sounds like. Maybe Dr. Miller, do you want to comment and start your setting the stage for your impressions?
Sure, yeah, and I completely agree. I think, making a public data set is time consuming and it's not easy. And I think people are doing, whether it's because they don't have the time or whether it's because they don't want to really make it shareable. I think both are problems. And even, I have a comment in my notes that even if, you have the best data dictionary, it's still, if you didn't actually create that data, it's very difficult sometimes to make heads and tails of it. So I have a few slides of similar perspective, just slightly from a slightly different approach. Is that
perfect?
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm coming at this from. So my thoughts on this topic are focused on kind of what I know best, which is organizing networks of researchers to collaborate in conducting research. And I was privileged to be involved in leading the T1D Exchange Clinic Network from 2010 to 2019, which included research investigators across 80 clinical centers. And purpose was to enroll over 30,000 patients into a registry of people with type 1, but also to work as a group to conduct numerous clinical trials and observational studies in type 1. And I believe this network accelerated clinical research in type 1 diabetes because of that collaboration. And so my main kind of point of this is that I think there's a need for a new network of data scientists and clinicians to work together to determine what data is available, combine it and harmonize the data, and then formulate questions, specific research questions that could be answered in an efficient manner. And there's many public T1D data sets available. We talked about it, it is an NIH requirement. It's also a requirement if you are doing a study funded by Hemsley Trust, but we have researchers doing the same legwork to make heads and tails of the data to answer the same questions. And even with, like I mentioned, even with the comprehensive data dictionary, it's extremely time intensive to make sense of it all. And you could say the same is true for grant proposals and ongoing clinical trials with various groups conducting kind of similar, smaller studies to answer the same questions. And I realize it may be the nature of academia for multiple groups to conduct similar but separate research, but I'd love to see a paradigm shift in T1D. And I think the shift is needed if we're going to make sense of the data. And I just wanted to share this. This is more a personal level, which Etta and Linda are familiar with this, but prior to our last T1D Exchange Clinic Network annual meeting, we asked all of the researchers across the 80 sites to share 3 words on what the network meant to them and the impact on the T1D community. And a few words that stand out to me that I think are relevant today. And what I'm talking about is that I believe are necessary for accelerating research are collaboration, innovative teamwork, mentorship, leadership, and colleagues. And just the idea that all this is data exists, but we're not going to be able to really do anything with it and push it forward until we can work together to make something happen.
Yeah, I love that last slide. And I think, I guess you could even say that the pandemic itself was kind of proof of concept of these kinds of ideas of working together because, right, the sense of urgency drove global collaboration across borders and resulted in a tangible outcome, right, the vaccine. So it's not like it can't be done, but it's going to take some elbow grease, I think, to kind of address it, and maybe some kind of stronger sense of urgency. I'm not sure. And you all know sort of all these complexities around these data. So let's see. I wondered if Dr. Basina would like to weigh in.
Hi, good morning. I'm just as a disclosure, so I'm more on a clinical side. So I'm less of the data user and analyzer, but more of the data providing center and collecting the data. And I'm also part of the T1D exchange. So thank you for Dr. Miller that providing some data. So we're working with several research centers, including, again, T1D Exchange and NIDDK and NIH. And we have at Stanford, our own Stanford Diabetes Research Center. So far, the data, it's more of the collaborative center that supports and helps the members of the center. But we are expanding that to collaborators in the Bay Area. And doing some contract agreements that we can share the data and share the repositories. But as a part of the Diabetes Center, with a collaboration with other divisions at within Stanford, we're part of the NIH consortium. So my later my interest was in the kind of interplay between exocrine and endocrine pancreas in type 1 diabetes. So we're part of the NIH consortium for acute pancreatitis and development of type 1 diabetes, or is it predisposition, or where is the chicken and the eggs? And as a part of that consortium, we are doing a lot of biorepositories and biobanking as a part of DDK and NIH, and providing our data collection to the sort of the whole data repository. Also, we're doing a lot of work with JABE Research Center and doing several studies in diabetes technology, funded and supported by JABE and a part of the JABE Center. So again, I'm more happy to answer a question about how valid, how valuable the data that we're collecting. And it was greatly mentioned that it's important of how accurate the data is in terms of for future to analyze this data and to be able to look at the patterns and conclusions. So that is, I think, the big part of the clinical research is how we make sure that the data is maintained accurately and there is no outliers or somebody who we enrolled into the studies that didn't really qualify for this particular study and using this data and kind of messing up with the data. So I think that part is very important for all the clinician researchers to be aware of and to be careful when we are actually recruiting the patient and conducting the studies.
Yeah, that's well said, and it's important. Yeah, it's a very important point that the physicians play a very important role in this, sort of the first interaction with these data and these patients. I wondered if Dr. Dimelio would like to say a few words on that.
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, I wanted to say this is a huge topic. So kudos to everybody for agreeing to be here, and for everybody for their thoughts on this. I think it's really great that we've assembled a group with a wide range of expertise and perspectives, because I always think a lot about the blind man and the elephant analogy, where you see what you see from a given perspective. And in this case, the elephant, and at least not the elephant in the room, but the elephant metaphorically is that amount of data that we're all generating. And I love that, Alice, you started with that. You're really clear, okay, we've got this big clinical trial and we pull this out, and just I think it's fascinating to think about. I think a lot of what I see as what I consider myself primarily as a clinical trialist and a clinician, a little bit of a translational person, but I see that a lot of these big data pulls and the big data analyses are often hypothesis generating, and then allow you to kind of dive in and do a smaller view and a smaller take, and then come back. But then it needs to come back out and be whatever we find has to be generalizable. I think, especially if I think about type 1 diabetes and the fact that we're finding all these endotypes of type 1, and we think about cures rather than a cure. And then some of the work I've done with Marissa, like, and Kellee shows that, you know, like we have to really personalize what we're offering to patients and kind of do a choose your own adventure on that other end around some aspects of clinical care. I thought, Amanda, you did a beautiful job of framing that we all need to speak the same language. And I think multidisciplinary groups, which is where I love to be and where I thrive, is are really going to be needed. And then I think whatever comes out has to be user friendly. So as somebody that's in an editorial role, making sure that people are sticking their data into repositories, but nobody really knows how to pull it out. And when they know how to pull it out, you know, sometimes you pull out the same data and you find two different sets of conclusions, and it's impossible to keep your eye on the scope of kind of what's going on. And then I'll just close my brief remarks again, just coming back to ultimately whatever we do has to be patient-centered, and it has to be with an eye on improving quality of life and improving care. You know, so no matter what the finding is of the big data, it's something, if we don't get into the hands of people and improve health, at least from my perspective as a clinician, we're not doing what we need to do. But I look forward to hearing other people's thoughts on the topic as well.
Yeah, fantastic and well said. I also agree that the whole idea of sort of the you know, everyone seeing their perspective through different lenses, it can add so much value to a discussion and sort of a jumping off point for future collaborations too. I wondered, you know, if Dr. Cengiz could make a comment as well. So sort of we've had 3 MDs and now she's an MD MHS in a row, to kind of round out that MD perspective.
Sure, yes, I mean, great comments, by the way. I don't want to repeat some of the comments, but just want to kind of give a little bit of the diabetes technology perspective, maybe incorporate some of my experiences in diabetes technology research. For diabetes technology research, with the advancement of technology, we had the ability to use sensors or other technology equipments, and that those devices generated massive amounts of data. Previously, when we were doing research, we had subjects, we had protocols, we were collecting data, and we were using our Excel sheets, and it was manageable. However, with this new technology and the amount of massive data generation, that was, I think, at least for me, was the first time that we realized we need big data management and big databases to collect all the information and also sort out what is valuable and what's maybe not as valuable. And to be honest with you, sometimes you realize what is not valuable right now could be an important data in the future. So it's always good to, I think, like keep the data and maybe harmonize it, but we also realized that it wasn't that easy to harmonize data when we were doing diabetes technology research. There were some collaborations, JDRF, Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, they built a consortium, so at least we were able to share our data and the first step to harmonize data. However, we realized that all of us, we don't have the bandwidth to build a good database, but still there's data out there. And I think another important step was to define success metrics measures for diabetes technology studies, so that when we were building our database, we were paying extreme attention to collect the essential data for our studies. And then came, sharing protocol ideas. So a database with study protocol data became an important point, and it allowed us to accelerate scientific trials, scientific studies, because rather than reinventing the wheel in our small, academic groups, we were able to share data and not repeat some of the same mistakes maybe another group made, and just move forward to the next step. Also, that way we learned that what is out there, what are the knowledge gaps. If somebody already addressed one issue, then you know what's the next knowledge gap in that field. So those databases, you know, even though they were separate, just by sharing and collaborating, we learned from each other what the next step should be. And we don't have unlimited grants, so our resources are limited. So that way we managed to prioritize what's next. And in terms of outcomes, again, you know, these databases taught us what worked, what did not work. We made educated, scientific, data-driven decisions quickly using some of those data sets and produce actionable insights. And are they perfect? And, you know, do we have like one big harmonized data for diabetes technology? Unfortunately, not yet. However, I'm hoping that that will be the case in the near future, because we don't have the luxury to waste that valuable data. I kind of see it as like a treasure chest. If you have a good database and if you have good, you know, scientists like know how to analyze it, there's so much to learn from databases. And again, that will accelerate how we do science. But we also, do we have the bandwidth to harmonize those databases? That's another question, because again, working in that field, I learned that it's not easy for someone, you know, like even if you have your budget for a study, you need to have other people that will help you to build that database, maintain that database, integrate that database, create the interface with other people's like databases. So I think in the future that would be crucial, and maybe there'll be some support for scientists to create such an infrastructure so that we can actually make this happen.
That's an incredibly important point, I think. Do you feel like it would be beneficial to have like a one institution or one place that would be a clearinghouse for some of these data, that would be sort of like a place that all type 1 diabetes scientists would send their data sets to be, further analyzed, a repository for these data? Or do you think it's better to have it, parsed out among different institutions? And anybody can answer, whoever feels that they have an answer.
I'll tell you my experience as a data science leader. We have 16 different disease area consortia at my nonprofit organization. And the challenge for us is that, so currently our T1D program has around 30 data sets, some of which we can share externally, some of which we use internally to develop models or identify different kinds of information that we have a really strong regulatory focus. So I know that the current issue is that the only recognized endpoint is on new onset of disease. And what about these other ways that we might look for earlier progression? So we've been doing a lot of this work, and with experience, I can tell you that yes, the answer is that it would be ideal if there was a single repository for type 1 diabetes. My experience tells me that it won't happen that way. So my new direction as a person who leads in all these different therapeutic areas, my new direction is to advocate for sharing with us, because we're neutral. We don't publish from your data. We help to work with the FDA to say these models show that there's a new biomarker or something like that. But we're not competing with anyone. And so I think ideally that would be the case, but I won't always be able to convince someone. Our executive directors of disease area consortia won't always be able to convince someone. And it's quite a different conversation for a clinician who's run a trial and really wants to share than it is for a company that ran a trial and it failed badly and they don't want everyone to know all of their failure information, right? And so I think that what we could get to that meets that request is, where possible, put it in a single repository, because that encourages exactly the same curation, standardization, and harmonization methods. So you get good consistency from one data set to another. But when that's not possible, we need to be ready to have application interfaces and APIs to be able to do federated analysis across multiple platforms. And so we currently are actually working with a couple of other global platforms to set those things up exactly in that way. And there's no competition between these platforms, but there are times when people are much more willing to share with, for example, a European company or a European nonprofit than they are willing to share with an American one, right? There are just lots of reasons that go into these conversations. And so what we do is kind of bypass that conversation and become good friends and collaborators with that other global platform. So I mean, I think that what I'm aiming for is a feeling that there's a repository for type 1 diabetes. I'm not sure that we'll ever actually have one. I mean, and to be fair to everyone here, we all know that this new cloud environment world, this virtual world, your data are in lots of different places anyway. Even if you think they're in one place, you know, it makes us feel good to think it's in one place, but it's actually in servers all over the place. So that's my perspective, Monica.
Yeah, no, that's well said. I wondered, did you have anything else to offer, Dr. Cengiz?
Well, a quick comment regarding actually type 1 diabetes exchange project, which worked pretty well. It was like one database that we all of us, like clinicians, researchers, we sent our data to type 1 diabetes exchange that was collected in a standardized way. And the outcomes has been amazing. I mean, the outcome, like all the outcomes have been amazing. A lot of junior faculty learned a lot from it. It generated so many studies. Also, we were able to publish so many papers using that data. Having said that, was that easy? It was not. There was funding to build that infrastructure. Even though we tried to have interface between our electronic medical records and type 1 diabetes database, it did not occur. And mainly the main reason was the electronic medical records. Yes, some of them were not clinical trials. However, we managed to build a great database, collaboration, and that was a success story in my view. So it happened before, however, it wasn't easy. And in the future, if we build a similar database, but also use our experiences from what we learned from type 1 diabetes exchange, I think it might work. But we need to study well and maybe bring everybody on a table so like we can discuss, brainstorm. And it's not just clinicians, it's not just researchers. We need people who are experienced in data, big data management. And then I think we can maybe make it work.
Yeah, I think it certainly sounds like it's going to take a 360-degree consortia to kind
Absolutely.
of create a pathway. I wondered, and sort of, I just wanted to tap on Dr. Hilliard. She's interacting with the lived experience, I think, of type 1 diabetic patients. And that's another kind of data set, but I think it's also very, very important. And I didn't know if you wanted to just sort of jump in and talk a little bit about those kinds of data.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for including me in this. As a psychologist and a behavioral scientist, I'm thinking about what all my colleagues on this call are talking about in terms of sharing and combining different types of diabetes data. And what we do and the kinds of things that we look at as clinical and especially behavioral scientists interacts with these types of data, but is a little bit different. So I think I wanted to just bring into the conversation patient-reported outcome data, and even on a smaller scale, qualitative data. So when we think about, Dr. DiMeglio mentioned that the goal of all of our research is to improve the lives of people with diabetes and their family members. And we're all doing different kinds of research to get there. And some of those data can really be easily harmonized and considered together. But I think when we think about this patient-reported data and getting the voices of people, that becomes much harder to harmonize and combine for a few reasons. There's increasing recognition that patient-reported outcomes are just as important as clinical biomarkers, but they're hard to measure. And I think sometimes there's an error in looking at biomarker data like A1C or time in range and inferring something about the psychosocial state of someone or about their behaviors, assuming that a certain A1C or time in range says something about their adherence to treatment or their self-management behaviors, maybe even about their quality of life or their diabetes distress. And we really can't infer those from these medical data. The only way to measure them is to ask people, what is your quality of life and what behaviors are you doing? Or to measure objectively, looking at their device data or their engagement with checking their blood glucose or giving insulin, that kind of thing. So we do measure those, and there's, an increasing attention to doing things like depression screening as part of clinical practice. And so if we think about harnessing the data that are being collected clinically, we can start to get at some of these questions on a bigger level. So places like the Type 1 Diabetes Exchange, both the clinic registry and then more recently the Quality Improvement Learning Collaborative, I think are really good models for how to start using those data that are collected clinically, like depression screeners or other screeners, and combining them across many sites in order to make some decisions and try out new ways to improve care. And so I think there's models for this, but they're limited, right? These are big, well-resourced, largely academic medical center practices. And so that limits whose data are being included in the scientific questions that are asked from those data. And then we also have challenges with patient-reported outcomes in that everyone likes their own favorite measure. Everyone has their favorite depression measure or their favorite measure of diabetes distress, or I study quality of life and resilience, and I like my measure better than the one that someone else created, right? And so there's all these challenges because when you talk about patient-reported outcomes, like we get really specific in our construct, like, well, that's diabetes burden and this is diabetes distress, and those are different, but like, are they? And so, when you start asking those questions and everyone has a slightly different measure, you can't combine them. They're doing different things. And just to add on the burden or the challenge with that, a lot of these measures are only validated in English. And so we're starting to validate them in other languages, Spanish sometimes, but not fast. And so we are leaving out huge portions of people whose experiences matter just as much, and sometimes, especially if we're talking about technology and treatment, maybe matter more because they're more likely to experience disparities, and we have less data on them, especially in technology research. So there's huge challenges in front of us in terms of collecting these patient-reported outcome data and combining them in the ways that we're talking about here, but it's, in my opinion, really pressing. And then I'll just push one step further, and then even smaller samples than that are qualitative research. So we can only learn so much from a survey. Once we get people in a room or on a phone call or in a chat and ask them, tell me about using this device. Tell me about your experience parenting a young child with diabetes. What would you like to see in an intervention? That's how we learn and move our studies forward and improve our care. But that requires small samples and in-depth data collection. And so you really can't start combining that across big groups because of the specificity of what we're asking. So I guess I just want to make the case that both matter, that we want to be combining and collapsing and using all these data from all these sites, but we also want to like get in there with someone and really understand their experience, and that can inform some of these bigger data that we are all trying to work on together to improve health and improve quality of life. So I think I will stop there.
Yeah, no, that's well said. I do think that it's like zooming in, zooming out, and gaining information from both angles. I did want to just sort of stop for a minute and put a poll out to the audience. And so I'm going to launch this, and I believe that I'm going to allow panelists to vote too. So we're going to launch this poll and ask the audience to kind of weigh in as well, and then we'll discuss it. And really the question is, this first one is, define the first change that needs to be implemented to streamline clinical data analyses. So do you think global standardization of T1D data sets is most important, or global accessibility portal to update T1D clinical data is most important, physician training on clinical T1D data reporting, T1D genetic data portal amplification and access, other, all of the above isn't there, but we can discuss that. And it looks like the global standardization is in the lead, at least for now. Yeah. And of course, we've been talking about different data sets too, the lived experience and, also the use of tools in the context of data of type 1 diabetes, and the use, and then of course the actual etaology, what's driving that. And so there's sort of multiple levels of data that surround the disease. And looks like most people have voted, so I'm going to end the poll, and it looks like the people that have voted on the global standardization of T1D data sets as being sort of the first change that needs to be made. And I just would like to ask the panelists to sort of weigh in on that result. Anybody can jump in.
So I just want to add to that, to the poll, but also to echo what others said before about that and about the data standardization, but also about the actual data reporting and sharing and having this one center who would coordinate that. So for example, for me, it would be great if there is going to be one center and there is a regulatory pathway for us to share the data, because it's so variable across the institutions. So even within our institution, it's Stanford Children's Hospital and Stanford Healthcare. So even for our two institutions who are basically on the same territory and the same administration, the data sharing is very different. What I can share, for example, with what Children's Hospital can share. So what my dream is, and I think that would be important to consider, is to have sort of the central we have one center, to have this one regulatory pathway for us to share the data, because it does take a long time for us to go through all the committees, through all the regulatory pathways to be able to share the data. As an example, for us, data mapping for type 1 diabetes exchange, it did take me, I can't even tell you how many months to be able to do this. And I'm not still able to fully share this data mapping with T1D exchange, although, are there neighboring institutions able to do it in a different way or provide some sort of different data? So, so again, data standardization and data, standardization of how do we actually submit this data? I think that's important.
I have a quick comment. Just my dream for type 1 diabetes clinical data collection is to have a smart EHR. Use it, because we're all now using electronic medical records. Even like a small town clinic in the middle of nowhere, like they have EHR that became almost standardized. There might be a few places maybe they don't. And there are certain common metrics for type 1 diabetes. We have the A1C, now we have time and range if they're using sensors. We want to see if they had depression screening. We want to see if they had annual labs. So there's certain pieces of data that is already standardized out there. However, we don't have smart electronic medical records. At least that's my impression. We can't even share like some of the templates among academic centers. I mean, maybe I didn't do a good job. I tried to, share information using Epic. However, you don't have that luxury. And some of the EHRs are not designed for patient care. They're designed mainly for billing and coding purposes. So my dream, again, if we have a smart EHR, we can actually design a database collection. It would be easy. And it would also be easy to collect all the data, those major, important metrics in a big data center. And, but it has to be done, as I said, in a way that maybe there'll be some interface with each one's electronic medical records and with that database, because it's expensive to have someone to just sit down, search through all the data, enter it, and that way harmonize it. So that would be my dream. And again, it's not a clinical trial, but I think there's still a lot to learn from that big data that we're collecting almost every day at the clinic. And that way we can collect data from not just big academic centers, but from everyone. And that way we can provide some resources or clinicians who are actually trying to treat type 1 diabetes in those little clinics out in the middle of nowhere with limited resources.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Sort of on the flip side, I just would make a quick comment that, you know, earlier in 2021, we hosted this D challenge where we provided a data set to the community and we asked them to kind of mine it and come up with a novel hypothesis. And we said you could use this set that we provided, a consensome of genetic omics data, and or you can use your own. And so University of Michigan had a really, you know, all these teams were operating, you know, and kind of sharing data on this Slack channel. And then the University of Michigan had a really great data set. And another group wanted to try to use their data set and add it to their own. And they couldn't because it, you know, it had the constraints around this genetic data set. So even on, like you're talking about, like the, you know, the stream of data coming from patients, but on the other side, there's already data in place and it's just siloed at these different institutions with these walls around it. And it wouldn't it be great if some of those walls might be able to be accessible? Not, you know, maybe not come down entirely, but if you had some sort of like ORCID ID or some kind of key, you're a card carrying, you know, scientist, and then you could have access or something like that. I just wanted to comment on that, you know, sometimes I think the data is not accessible on both sides of things. Okay, I'm going to quickly do poll number 2, and I'm going to ask it to the audience. What is the next step? Can everyone see this? What next step is critically important to using the clinical data to understand the etiology of T1D? Global data repository and genetic clinical data, a wider adoption of bioinformatic analysis of the clinical data, wider adoption of AI analysis of clinical data, all of the above, none of the above. Well, this is pretty, looks like all of the above is coming forward as the top one. And maybe people can sort of chip in and talk a little bit about AI analysis and bioinformatic analysis and that layer of, that added layer of understanding and how more scientists might access it, I guess. Okay, I'm going to end the poll because of time. And I'll share it.
I think the challenge with that one is that it sort of builds on what our panelist mentioned about being able to utilize data from electronic health record, which is what the NIH and the FDA are calling real world data. And using real world data to produce real world evidence is a very large chasm, right? For a lot of reasons. One is that you're not recording patient information consistently from one to another. I mean, it's opportunistic data, right? So it wasn't a well-designed study. There was no randomization. And so you're not collecting information about drugs at a defined interval. There are a lot of challenges, but I think the biggest one, I will agree with Dr. Cengiz, it's that many of these electronic health record systems in hospitals are really designed to be able to capture billing and return, you know, profit and investment. I think that the challenge with adding in genetics and genomics is that having those two things in one place, what you're dealing with is an entire set of laws in the United States alone around privacy for genetic and genomic data. And now you're combining it with HIPAA concerns because you have patient privacy in these medical records. So we do actually actively work not in type 1 diabetes yet, but I can tell you that it's a pretty long runway that we're all going to have in all areas of disease research, which is being able to not just collect the clinical data or the genetic data. Those things by themselves are not as helpful, but when you have them together, I'm going to just close the loop with our first topic, which is standardization and agreeing to do things the same way. So there's a group that I know GA4GH is a group that is participated with Broad and with Jackson Labs and with the European Bioinformatics Institute. And I have a member of my team who's actually a part of the Genomic Standards Consortium. And that's really about defining interfaces and automating the extraction of data, Dr. Cengiz, from electronic health records, automate the extraction, but also automate the combination of the genetic information with the clinical data. And so it really just comes back to maximizing the value by always doing things in the same way, no matter what study, no matter who's leading it. Try to first agree on some standards for how this should work, and then everyone plays in the sandbox with the same tools, right? I mean, that's the future. I do think we have a little bit of a long way to go there, but I think that's absolutely going to be the next way that we revolutionize disease.
I just want to add a little bit here when I heard making things easy, and that might be the low-hanging fruit. How can we make it easier for people to share their data? Because as a research scientist, it's a hassle and a burden for us. I want to get it out there. Anybody asks me, I'm sharing it. But it really, the tools aren't there to make it easy. And that's me thinking in a whole nother realm of how to do all of that. And if we had a way to assist for doing that, I think you would get better buy-in. It would happen easier. People would do it. And then that harmonization will happen right after that, when everybody's kind of experienced a good data sharing event.
Right.
Yeah.
What would some ideas be about how you might go about building some kind of data sharing, portal, or what are some ideas around that? I mean, we've talked about the NIH, sort of new way of doing business, but obviously there's some gaps there. So what, in an ideal world, what would you think would be some ways to make it happen?
For me personally, I think they're nice portals. It would be great if they're a little easier to use, but I would love to have just a consultant or somebody there to say, okay, here's your data. This is a great way to put it together. Here's how you should annotate it, because that's not where my mind is. Yeah. And this is how people on the other end are going to use it. And so I just need some consultation of how to do that well. And if that's a list of items that you check off, and I also don't want it to be like a 2-week task it needs to be a day-long task. And so if that means that I can reach out to somebody who does that on a daily basis, knows what to do, and can help me with it, I think that would completely facilitate sharing of data.
Does anyone else want to share?
I really think it needs to be automated in some way if this is really going to happen on a large scale. And I think, T1D Exchange Quality Improvement Network is trying to do this with having sites map their data for quality improvement, and it's worked. And there's about, I think, 20 sites who have mapped data where it's pulling directly through an API from the EMR. But like others have mentioned, it's not an easy process. I mean, it's a very tedious process to make that happen. But yeah, there's other countries like the DPV registry in Germany and Austria have been doing this for many, many years, and it's because they have universal healthcare system. They're all using the same EMR. It just flows right into the same database, and they have, every child with diabetes goes into the exact same database. And we could get there, it's just a lot harder in the US. I mean, anyone who's tried to enter data into clinicaltrials.gov, I mean, that's like a nightmare in itself a lot of times. And so it has to get easier for it to work, both on like a real world data side and a clinical trial side.
Yeah, there has to be a carrot, I think, for the people that own the data in the end for this to happen. And like Kellee was saying, and Marina was saying, like, we are also trying to map our data here locally to get into the exchange registry. And the issue is that you're trying to bridge between academia and the hospital, and it's not the hospital's top priority. So for us, the hospital's top priority is US news, patient care, like things like that. So if we can tie it to a measurable outcome and get the buy-in, because it takes the time, it takes the expertise, it takes the money. I think for it to really happen, there either has to be a mandate that it happens, but if there's mandates that are coming and but they have to be then usable, and then there has to be a carrot for the groups that would provide it. And I think, things follow money, and in this particular case, and the expertise will follow the money, and the data will flow with the money.
I see that there is a question out here. How should this vital discussion of data harmonization and data sharing between healthcare organizations consider the ever increasing interest from the public to have patient data ownership.
Well,
I guess
I have
oh, sorry,
a
go.
perspective to add, and it's a really brief one. I'll be quick. There are disease-focused groups like the National Organization for Rare Disorders, for example, who collect patient registry data. Another group that I know of called RareX, they're collecting patient data and working with the Broad Institute to customize a platform for this. And they've really been pushing a really interesting model where the owner of the study, so in this case, several of the members of this distinguished panel probably are PIs on studies, and you're the ones that have to sign off to say you can share these data because I'm the PI and I own the data. And some of these patient groups are actually kind of flipping that paradigm, which is we will build a study for you and we'll contribute our data, but we own it. So if someone requests access, it's not going to Dr. X to get access to a data set. It's requesting access to that data set, and each of the patients in the study has the ability to permit or deny access to their own data. And I think that's interesting. I mean, it's not ideal, to be honest with you, because what I'd like is to have a blanket yes for access to that data set as a researcher. But I understand the motivation for it. And I also think that there's potential that in the long term, it can help us because, you know, lots of companies are finding profit from selling our data, right? And not just social media. I mean, that includes hospital systems and insurance companies. And so there are some beautiful databases where everything that's ever happened in a hospital has been curated, standardized, and cleaned. And if you have tens of millions of dollars, they'll let you peek at it. But it's been collected by hospital systems and it's been collected by insurance companies for many years, right? And so there's this idea that patients want to retake control of their information. It's mine. I participated in the study and I decide who gets to see it, right? So it's an interesting thing that's happening. I just wanted to bring that up and make people aware.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I mean, it does seem like sort of some kind of carrot that might come in would be a partnership by a big company. And then I don't even know, like Google, I mean, Verily or something like Palantir or some big company like that, big data based company that might come alongside, or even like Chan Zuckerberg, come alongside the type 1 diabetes community and feel that there's some interest to trying to make this happen more quickly. Who knows? Maybe. But
actually,
yeah,
I know of at least one of those really exciting press release just came out within the last few months, where Roche Diagnostics is funding Great Ormond Street Hospital in London to, they're basically paying for the technology and the platform for the clinicians to collect patient data for neonates, I believe is the subject, being able to collect all this patient data in pediatrics. And basically they're paying for the hospital to do whatever it is that they want. The only agreement is that they get access to the data at the end in order to develop better diagnostic tools. So I think you're going to see that, Monica. I mean, I think that's one of many arrangements like that that's going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, if patient data is anonymized and carefully curated, and I think, it could be so valuable and push towards better treatment of the type 1 diabetes and potentially a cure. So if that's the case, then isn't it worth it? So I think we're at the top, a little past our time frame, and in sort of just respect for everyone's busy schedules, we're gonna say goodbye today. I just would like to thank you all again for participating and for your incredibly insightful commentary and opinions. It's just amazing, and I thank you so much for all you're doing in so many different realms for those that suffer with type 1 diabetes every day. I appreciate it from bottom of my heart, and we'll see you at the next one, some of you at the next State of the Science coming up March 10th, where we're going to talk about interdisciplinary lenses that look at type 1 diabetes, and then our the final State of the Science on March 24th, where we're really going to have a very interesting discussion about creating a roadmap forward in the field of type 1 diabetes. So thanks again and have a great rest of your day.